guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, we're going to be making an end grain cutting board. Well, if you're watching this show and you've come beyond the intro, obviously you have some interest in making an end grain cutting board. Maybe you found the show by searching it out, and if you did, that's fantastic. And I know there's 1,000,001 videos out there on how to make end grain cutting boards, and what's going to make mine any different? I don't know, other than it's me. So what we're going to do is staying true to the form of my show. I don't know how long this show is going to be. It may be a single show, it could be 2 parts. At this stage in the game, I haven't even started and I don't really know. But hopefully by the end of everything, and when everything is said and done, you will have absolutely 0 questions in your mind as to what it takes to make one of these. And truth be told, if you haven't tried it out, if you haven't made one of these yet in your woodworking career, you're really cheating yourself, because it's a really fun project. I don't know what else to say about it, but why don't we start off with getting into the wood selection. Now, I see all kinds of questions online, guys asking, is this wood okay for a cutting board? Is that wood okay for a cutting board? It's really an easy concept to know what is good and what is bad. And what you want essentially is a tighter grained wood that's a hardwood. And of course, the most classic examples are walnut and maple, which I will be using in this build. And it also happens to be my favorite combination. But you've got cherry. Cherry is a great wood to use. Some people ask, is pine okay? Pine is just fine for a cutting board. The problem with pine is that it's not a hardwood, and it takes a lot of abuse from the knives, and it's not going to last very long. It will break apart, it will take on damage. People have had success with it, but not this guy. So this guy is going to use walnut and maple. So the first thing we're going to do is select our rough cut stock that we need for this, and we're going to take it over to the jointer. Well, we've got some chunks of maple picked out, and you can see some obvious flaws in the wood. And we've got to be careful to work around that. I've got one little knot right here on this chunk of walnut, and again, make sure that you're planning ahead to make sure that these particular flaws aren't going to get in the way of your board. End grain cutting boards are a time-consuming process, but it's a fun process. The last thing you want is to have flaws in the wood where you thought you had all your stock laid out perfectly, and next thing you know, you got to go back and go through the whole process again because one little knot ended up getting in your way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be working in 16-inch lengths of this walnut and in the maple. So I'm going to cross cut these to 16 inches, and I've already calculated how many I'm going to need. And then once I get them cut, I'm going to take them over to the jointer and get one surface nicely jointed. And then I'm going to come back and see you, and I'm going to explain how it is that you want to figure out or calculate how much stock you're going to need. Well, I have all the pieces of maple and walnut. I've got them all face planed to get a nice flat surface. And as well, I've jointed the edges to give me a 90-degree surface to work from. You need to consider at this point in time what type of cutting board you're going to make. And you probably saw in the in the beginning image of the video that I'm going to be doing one that is in the pattern of a brick wall. So first off, you need to decide what dimension your board is going to be. And for mine, it's going to be 10 inches and it'll be 14 inches long. We have one that works quite fine with that, and that's what I'd like to duplicate. You also need to decide what size of bricks you're going to be making. And my bricks, I would like them to be 3 inches by 7/8 of an inch high. Now, the 7/8 of an inch is an important measurement here, because in our first glue up, 7/8 of an inch will actually be the thickness of our stock. And the way that it's going to work, to get this 14 inches, in order to do our first glue up, we need to know how many bricks we're going to need to get across here. In order to do this pattern correctly, I'd like to have a 3-inch brick here, a 3-inch brick here, another 3-inch brick here, a 3-inch brick here, and then this last one will be half that dimension, which is 1.5. And then when we start assembling this whole thing, of course, this will be reversed, whereas this will be the 1.5, and then these ones here subsequently will be 3 inches. So in order to do this, this is 3, 6, 9, 12, 13.5 inches, and we will have the mortar joints that will go in between here, which will be maple, and these mortar joints will be 3/16 of an inch thick. So what we're going to need to do for our first glue up is we're going to need to mill some 7/8 of an inch thick stock by 3 inches, and we're going to need 1, 2, 3, 4 of them, and then one at 1.5 inches wide. So let's go ahead and mill those pieces. We're going to need to resaw them on the bandsaw, run them through the thickness planer to get them to their 7/8 of an inch thick. But 4 pieces, 3 inches wide, and 1 piece 1.5 inches wide, and all of our pieces for this project are going to be 16 inches long. So that's going to be a general number for the entire project, 16 inches long. Walnut is milled 7/8 of an inch thick, and if you remember, it was 1 piece 7/8 thick by 1.5 inches wide, and then 4 pieces 7/8 of an inch thick by 3 inches wide. And like I said, they're all 16 inches long. What I've also done is milled a little bit of maple, and I have 4 strips here, and they are 7/8 of an inch wide by 3/16 of an inch thick. And these are going to represent the mortar in the bricks. And what we're going to have to do is do our first glue up. And an end grain cutting board has a series of glue ups, and this will be the first one. So what we're going to need is to glue them up in this kind of a configuration. A 3-inch wide piece, then a piece of maple, another 3-inch wide piece, and then another piece of maple, and another 3-inch wide piece, another piece of maple, 3-inch wide piece, maple, and lastly, the 1.5 inch piece. But the question now is, what kind of glue are we going to use? I've heard it a million times over and over and over again, guys saying, you don't need any kind of special glue to make an end grain cutting board. I use regular wood glue all the time. And you know what? That works for them. And if that works for them, that's great. But for my time and for the quality of my work, I'll be adhering this board together using a waterproof glue. And in this case, it happens to be Titebond 3. It's the only glue I've ever used for cutting boards because of its waterproof nature. It also has a longer open time, which gives me a little more room to work, a little more wiggle room when it comes to putting this whole glue up together. So if you want to use your regular wood glue, you can. I'm not going to suggest it because I've never tried it and I have no desire to try it. So I don't want all the comments down the bottom of, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're using that Titebond 3. You can just use regular wood glue. If that's the way you want to do it, knock yourself out. That's just fine, but it's not the way I'm doing it. Titebond 3 is the way I'm going to go, and it's what I would suggest to you that you may want to use for yours. It is the waterproof one. It's also food safe. So what more could you ask? Now that we've got the type of glue, we have our boards ready to go. The next step now is to get yourself some bar clamps and let's glue this thing up. Now the key to any successful glue up is going to be preparation, and in this case I think I've got everything together. This glue up is a messy one, so if you don't want any glue on your bench, lay some newspapers down. I also have some wax paper laid over top of the bars of my clamps because the water-based glue that will be in contact with the metal bar of the clamps will actually stain your wood. You'll get big black marks on it and then you have to deal with those. So I have all of my pieces here, the 3-inch pieces ready to go, and we're going to start off by spreading the Titebond 3 on these particular pieces, and we're going to glue them all up one by one here. So we'll start by spreading the glue onto these pieces. And I've already shown you how to go about gluing this, so now it's just a matter of doing it. Need a little more glue on there. And again, this is Titebond 3 for those of you who are wondering still or didn't listen to me when I said what type of glue it was. Anyway, right to the end, and on all surfaces, I want to get a nice coating of glue. Don't be shy on it. It is going to drip everywhere, and we know that, and then we're okay with that. That's why we have the newspapers down. So put the spreader away. I'm going to unclamp these boards, and we're going to start in one by one. And this, as I said, is going to be messy. Don't think it's not going to be. So a piece of walnut there, followed by a piece of maple, another piece of walnut, and now this is where it gets a little funky because there's no glue on the maple, so we're going to spread glue on both sides of this piece. And if you don't think you're going to get your, if you think you're going to keep your fingers clean, you might as well forget it for this project. So there we go, just like that, and then another piece of walnut, just like that, and then we need another piece of maple. And a piece of walnut. One more piece of maple here. Well, I sure wasn't shy with the glue on that piece. And then lastly, this last piece of walnut here will need some glue on it, and we'll just spread that on and lay it in place.
once we get that done, we can go ahead and clamp her in here, and you want to keep an eye out on this. Just make sure that these boards in the glue up aren't shifting. We don't want these to get all off kilter, and I mean they'll just look like hell. So we're just going to arrange our wax paper just a little bit over to one side and lay in our walnut board. And now we're going to go ahead and clamp this in together, trying to line up these edges as best we can and trying to keep it flat. If you have to add a caul to it to keep everything down and flat, that's okay too. I may even end up having to do that. Now we went a little bit wonky on this one edge here, and I'm okay with that. I'm going to trim that up after. I've got it fairly flat on the top, and that's what I was really hoping for. So I'm going to leave this for an hour now, and once that hour has passed, I'm going to come back and just scrape off all of this squeeze out. I know I'm going to get comments here of guys saying, oh, it's so much easier to wipe it off now. I don't agree. Not in this case. It makes a smeary mess all over the place, and for me with this type of glue up, I actually prefer to scrape it. So I'm going to wait an hour. I'm going to come back, we're going to scrape this off, and then we're going to carry on with our cutting board build. Well, while we're waiting that hour to scrape the squeeze out off of that first glue up, we actually have to prep and get ready for a second glue up here. And what we need for that is some 7/8 inch thick maple boards. Now, we're going to end up laminating them in a glue up side by side with the long grain glued together. And the length, it's hard to say how long it's going to be. I'm going to do mine with whatever scrap I had in the rack. I think it ended up to be 16 inches long. But the width of your glue up needs to equal the length of your board. In my case, the board is going to be 14 inches long. I think I said at the beginning I'm making a 10 by 14 inch cutting board. So I need the total width of this maple glue up to be 14 inches. So I'm going to start off by resawing some maple, and let's get that going to get that stock plane to its final dimension. We've got all the maple pieces cut that we have to do for our next glue up, but time has come to scrape the glue off of this particular one, and I'm just using a 1-inch scraper. It's nothing special, it's just a cheap little, basically hardware store type putty scraper, and we're just gonna get the majority of this squeeze out off of our stock. And it doesn't have to be right down to the bare wood with not a bit showing, but get as much of it off as you can, because that's going to help in the later steps to get it straightened all out. So go ahead and squeeze all that, or scrape all that squeeze out off. Tongue-tied. I'm excited. Scrape off your squeeze out, guys. Alright, so it only takes a couple minutes to get that squeeze out scraped off of there. So unclamp this now, spin the thing over, and scrape the glue off of the other side of the glue up, and then clamp this back up and leave it for overnight. The other glue up is off to the side, all of the squeeze out is cleaned up, and now it's just a waiting game for that. Like I said, bare minimum overnight. So I've got some 7/8 inch maple here, and we need to do this glue up just like this. And what this glue up is for is it's going to be the horizontal mortar lines in our brick, and it will be the mortar line in between each course of bricks on our cutting board. So it has to be at least, this glue up has to be at least as wide as what our length is on our cutting board, as I've already said. And this here is a little longer. This is actually 15.5. I only need 14, but that's going to give me some room to play with. I'd just like to point out that in all of these glue ups and in all of this entire process, it is absolutely imperative that you make sure that your blade is cutting square to your table and that you're starting off with square edges. As soon as you introduce unsquare edges to glue together, you end up with, of course, unsquare glue ups, and this is very exaggerated, but it's going to be cupping and nothing is going to mate. So you really need to ensure that all your edges are square and that all of your glued edges fit together just perfectly. So let's go ahead and glue up this maple for our horizontal mortar marks. So the same setup as before. I've actually replaced the paper down here because it was a little gummed up. So I've replaced the newspaper on the bench, and I've replaced the wax paper because of course that was all gummed up from the other glue up. So now it's time to glue these maple pieces together. Absolutely no difference in the procedure whatsoever, with one little minor, I'm gonna not even call it an inconvenience, but it's just a little different. You saw that I had them clamped together before, and I was able to spread all of the glue on all of the pieces at one time. And of course, that's because they were all the same size. If you want to do that with this, of course you can. You'll just have to make sure that you've got them all cut the same size so that all their edges mate. But for my situation here, they're all different sizes, so it's pretty hard to do that with. But no problem. Using the Type Bond 3 affords you that little extra time because it does have the longer open time, so you can, have a little more time to play around with it and make sure things are adjusted correctly. So we're going to go ahead, get this all together. We're going to clamp it up, and then just like we did with the first glue up, on this second glue up here, we're going to give it that hour, and like it or not, then we're going to scrape off all of the glue that has squeezed out of this particular glue up. And with that, we're at a complete and total standstill for at least overnight. We have both glue ups done. That's 2 out of 3. Normally with an end grain cutting board, there's actually only 2 glue ups. This one has the different element of the end grain horizontal mortar lines, which incorporated that maple glue up that we just did. So the main glue up with the bricks and mortar, being the walnut and maple, is sitting waiting to dry for overnight, and the glue squeeze out is of course cleaned up, and that's got to wait. So guys, I hope you're going to join me next week when we're going to complete this, do the final glue up of the build, and now we're getting into the cutting the parts and the assembly. This is when things start coming together. So I hope you've enjoyed today's show, and I'm going to see you again next week with yet another woodworking video.